She stood on the church steps in the rain and heard the words come out of a preacher's mouth like a door closing. I'd pictured someone softer. Bellwether, Montana Territory. Spring, 1889. The snow had come off the mountains all at once that year. The Bitterroot ran brown and swollen and took 2 footbridges with it, and the whole valley smelled like wet cottonwood and turned earth. Water stood in the wheel ruts. The sky hung low enough to touch the barn roofs. Etta Barlowe had come in on the mail wagon because the stage wouldn't run in that mud. She climbed down at the crossroads with her skirt heavy to the knee and her hair pinned flat under a bonnet that had been black once and was gray now. She was 34. She had a trunk, a carpet bag, and a letter she'd read so many times the crease had worn through the middle and split it into 2 pieces she carried, folded together like they were still one. Deacon Harlan Pike had written it, a widower. 46. He kept 160 acres of hay ground and a house with an empty kitchen and a congregation that had begun to talk. He wrote plainly. He said he didn't need a beauty and didn't want a girl. He said he wanted a woman who knew what work was and wouldn't run for hard winter. Etta had read that part out loud to herself in a rented room in Missouri, and something in her chest had gone quiet for the first time in a year. She'd written back and told him the truth. All of it. She'd expected the letter to stop coming. It hadn't. That was why she'd come. Now she stood in front of the white church at the north end of Bellwether, with rain running off the brim of her bonnet, and Reverend Ambrose Teague stood 1 step above her in the doorway, with his hands folded and his face arranged into something that thought it was kindness. Behind him, in the dark of the vestibule, Harlan Pike stood with his hat in his hands and did not come forward. "You've had a long road," the Reverend said. "There's coffee inside." Etta didn't move. "Say it out here," she said. "It'll go down easier in the rain." Teague's mouth pressed thin. "There's been a letter," he said. "From Cedar Bluff." "Croft," she said. "Dr. Ansel Croft, yes, a man of standing. He is that. He writes that you attended his wife, that she died, that her death was owed to your hands." The rain filled up the silence. Etta looked past him at Harlan Pike in the doorway, and Pike looked at the floor, and that was the whole conversation right there, without a word in it. She said, "Did the letter tell you she died 11 days after, of fever? Did it tell you he came to that birth straight from a corpse he'd been cutting on all morning? And I asked him, I begged him, to wash his hands, and he laughed at me in front of his own wife." Teague's chin lifted a little. "That is not a thing a woman says about a physician." "No," Etta said. "It isn't. That's what he was counting on." The Reverend spread his hands, the way men do when they've decided to be sorry about something they've already finished doing. "Whatever the right of it," he said, "the congregation has heard. A minister's church can't be built on a name folks are whispering over. Surely you see." And he hesitated, and then said it anyway, because a certain kind of man always says it anyway. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Barlowe. From the letters I'd pictured someone softer." Etta stood in the rain and looked at him. She was aware in some cold back room of her mind of exactly what she looked like, 34 and weather-worn. A mouth that didn't hold a smile without being told. Hands scrubbed raw and red from 12 years of carbolic and lye. The knuckles thick, the nails cut down to nothing. A body built by hauling water. Her mother had called her handsome, the way you call a mule handsome, meaning it will get you there. Softer. Harlan Pike finally spoke from the doorway. He said, "You're not what the letter promised," and his voice cracked in the middle of it like he knew. Etta said, "I told you every word of the truth in that letter. Turns out you'd rather have a promise." She bent and took the trunk handle in her right hand. Teague said quickly, "You'll want to leave that inside. The eastbound comes through Thursday. There's no call to be dragging." "I'll carry it," she said. He said, "It's heavy." "I've caught 106 babies," Etta said. "I'll manage a trunk." And she turned and went down the church steps into the mud, and she did not look back, and the rain came down on the white church behind her, and on her bare red hands, and on the whole of Bellwether, which had come to its windows to watch, because that is what a town does. It doesn't welcome and it doesn't warn. It watches, and it decides, and it goes back to its supper. She got as far as the feed store before her arm gave out. Not gave out, shook. She set the trunk down in 4 inches of standing water because there was nowhere else to set it, and she stood over it and breathed, and she did not cry. Because she'd learned in Cedar Bluff that crying is a thing you spend, and she had a long way left to go. An old man was sitting on a nail keg under the feed store awning, 81 years old, thin as a whip and about as easy to break, with a white beard gone yellow at the corner of his mouth from the pipe. Wendell Fry. He'd sold seed and oats in that building since before there was a road to it. He watched her breathe. He didn't offer to help, which she was grateful for. He said, "You put that down like it insulted you." Etta said, "It's holding up better than the rest of the day." Wendell nodded slowly. He looked out at the rain. He said, "Teague's a good enough preacher. Man can lay out the mercy of God like a man laying brick. Never has figured out how to spend any of it himself." Etta almost laughed. It surprised her. She put her hand over her mouth like she'd said something wrong. That was when the wagon came up the street. It came slow because everything came slow that week. A flatbed with a load of iron and a bay mare that didn't like the water and was doing it anyway. The man driving was maybe 45. Broad through the shoulder and thick through the wrist, in a way that told you his trade before you saw the anvil scars on his forearms. Dark hair going iron at the temple. A face that had been left out in a lot of weather and hadn't complained. He pulled up. He looked at the trunk in the water, and then he looked at Etta, and then he turned his head a little sideways, angling his right ear toward her, which she would learn later meant he was listening hard. He said, "That yours?" Etta said, "Depends who's asking and what they want." "Josiah Rennick," he said. "I keep the forge across the creek. And what is it you want, Mr. Rennick?" "Nothing worth the trouble of saying," he said. "Wagon's going that way. Trunk could ride in it." Etta looked at him a long moment. Her whole life had taught her that help arrives with a hook in it, and you don't feel the hook until you try to swim off. She said, "Charity's got strings on it." Josiah looked down the street at the white church. He looked back at her. He said, "This ain't charity. It's a wagon going my way. You can walk beside it if it makes you feel better about the arrangement." Wendell Fry made a sound around his pipe stem that might have been a laugh. Etta put her hand on the trunk. Then she took it off. "All right," she said. He got down and lifted the trunk, one-handed into the bed, and something inside it shifted and clinked. Glass on glass. And he heard it and looked at her, but he didn't ask. He set his hand out to help her up, and she took it, and his palm was hard as a hoof and warm through the rain. And she let go the second her boot found the board. They rode out of Bellwether without saying anything. The creek was up over the ford, so he took the long way around by the cut bank, and the mare picked her way, and the water in the low field went silver where the light broke. Halfway out, Josiah said, "You come all the way for Pike?" "I came for Honest," Etta said. Pike was the address on it. Josiah nodded once, looking straight ahead. He said, "Harlan Pike's not a wicked man. He's just never once in his life stood alone in a room." Etta said nothing. Josiah said, "I heard what Teague said to you." On the steps, her jaw tightened. "You were sitting in the street." "I was. And I'm deaf on the left side. Took a bad weld in 81. The whole thing come apart, so I don't hear much I'm not aimed at." He turned his head slightly, that same angling, but I heard that. Etta looked at her hands lying in her lap, red, split at the knuckles, nails cut to the quick. She said, "He wasn't wrong about the soft part." Josiah looked over. It was a short look, and he put his eyes back on the road, but she felt the weight of it. He said, "Hands like that aren't plain, ma'am. They're paid for." Etta Barlowe had been called a great many things in the last 14 months. Murderess, butcher, poor unfortunate. She'd been called handsome once by a man who wanted a favor. Nobody had ever looked at her hands and understood what they cost. She turned her face to the rain so he wouldn't see it, and she said nothing, and the wagon went on. The forge sat on a bench of high ground above the creek with the water running loud below it. A stone chimney. A shop with the doors thrown open and the coals banked. A cabin behind, low, tight chinked with 2 windows. Inside it smelled like coal smoke and coffee and hot iron, which is a smell like nothing else and doesn't leave a house once it's in the wood. There was a table, 2 chairs. One of them had a shawl over the back of it that was 8 years out of fashion and had not been moved. Josiah set her trunk down beside the stove where the heat would get at it. He poured coffee. He set the cup in front of her and then went and stood by the window with his own. And he didn't sit down, and Etta understood that he was giving her the room. She said, "I'll be gone Thursday." "The eastbound," Josiah said. "Thursday's a long way off in this weather. I don't have money for a hotel. I didn't ask you for any." "There's talk in that town already," she said. "There'll be more if I sleep out here." He drank his coffee. He said, "There's a stove and a chair and a door with a bar on the inside of it, and I sleep in the shop with the horses when it's cold, which it is. Anybody in Bellwether wants to make something of that. They can come out here and say it to me directly, and it's a mile and a half in the mud, so I don't figure they will." Etta sat down. The fire ticked. Outside, the creek went on the way creeks do, saying the same thing over and over and never getting tired of it, she said. "You don't want to know if it's true." Josiah turned around. He said, "About the doctor's wife?" Etta made herself look at him. "Yes." He was quiet a while. He set the cup down on the sill. He said, 8 years ago this June, my wife went into labor 2 weeks early and the baby was turned wrong. There wasn't a midwife closer than 14 miles. I wrote it in the dark. Woman name of Sadie Grimes, 60 years old. Hadn't been on a horse in 10 years. She got up out of her bed and came. She was too late. I buried them both on the ridge behind this house." He picked the cup back up and looked into it. He said, "Whole Valley talked about Sadie for a year. Said she was too slow. Said she should have known. Not one soul ever thanked her for getting on that horse." He looked up. He said, "So no, I don't want to know. I've had 8 years to think about what it costs to get on the horse. If you'd rather tell me, tell me. But you don't owe it to this house." Etta Barlowe sat very still. Then she opened the trunk. Not all of it. Just the top tray. Oilcloth folded back. A pair of scissors with a bone grip worn to a shine by 3 generations of thumbs. A spool of cord tape. A bottle of ergot. A cake of Castile soap in a tin. A brown bottle of carbolic half gone. A rubber bulb, she said. "Lavinia Croft died of childbed fever 11 days after I put her daughter in her arms. Her husband delivered the afterbirth himself because he didn't trust me to. He had come from a dissection at the college that morning. There was blood dried in the seam of his thumbnail. I asked him to wash. He said soap was for laundresses. She touched the tin. She said, when she started to burn, he needed it to be somebody. And it's a long fall from doctor to man who killed his own wife. And it's a short one from midwife to nothing at all." Josiah Rennick did not say he was sorry. He did not say it wasn't her fault, which she would have hated, because she knew that already, and hearing it from a stranger only made it small. He said, "You keep the soap on top, right where your hand falls." Etta looked down at the trunk. "Yes," she said. He nodded like something had been settled, and he went out to bank the coals. The rain quit on the 3rd day, and the valley came up green so fast you could nearly watch it. Etta didn't leave Thursday. There was no reason on paper. The eastbound came and went, and she stood in the yard and listened to the whistle go down the valley. And then she went inside and started supper, and Josiah came in and saw the pot on the stove and did not say one word about it. And that was the whole of the conversation. She earned her keep. She would not be told otherwise. She scrubbed 8 years of coal dust out of the cabin windows. She dug the drowned onions out of the garden patch and put in what could still be put in. She learned to hold a horse's head while Josiah shot it, standing at the shoulder, talking low, and he watched the way animals settled under her hands, and he didn't remark on it. He worked. He was the best hand with iron for 60 miles, and everybody knew it, and nobody said it, because Bellwether wasn't a town that said things. He turned wagon tires. He straightened plowshares the flood had wrenched. Toby Creel, 16 and all elbows, pumped the bellows and stole looks at Etta and turned red. She noticed things about Josiah Rennick, that he never sat in the chair with the shawl on it, that when he ate he set his fork down between bites, the way a man does who was taught by somebody he loved, that he turned his head to hear you, and that folks in town took that for coldness and he'd stopped correcting them a long time ago, that there was a grave up on the ridge behind the house with a hand-forged iron marker on it, scrolled and beaten fine, worth more work than most men put into a living thing, with 2 names on it. Cora, and under it, smaller, no name at all. Just, our girl. Etta walked up there once in the evening and stood a while and came down without saying anything. He noticed things about her, that she washed her hands before she touched food and after, and again, until they cracked and bled at the knuckle, and she'd stand there flexing them like she was angry at them. That she woke at every sound in the night, that she never once complained and never once asked for anything, and that both of those things were injuries and not virtues. That she was not plain, that she had a face like a cutbank in low sun, nothing pretty about it, and you couldn't stop looking. Word got around, the way it does. Prudence Kell, who taught the school, rode out under the excuse of borrowing a hinge and stayed 2 hours. Wendell Fry sent a sack of seed potatoes with no note. 3 women crossed the street in town, rather than pass Etta on the walk, and one of them, Harlan Pike's sister, said something behind her hand loud enough to be heard. And on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of May, Dr. Ansel Croft stepped off the westbound at Bellwether Crossing in a good gray coat, with a folding table and a case of tonics, on what he described to the Reverend as a circuit of medical improvement through the territories. Etta saw him from across the street. She stopped walking. Her whole body stopped, the way a rabbit's does. Josiah, 3 steps ahead, felt the absence of her and turned around. She said very quietly, "That's him." Croft was a handsome man. That was the thing nobody ever accounted for. Silver at the temples, warm brown eyes, a laugh that made you feel let in. He was shaking Reverend Teague's hand, and the Reverend was beaming, and behind them a half-circle of Bellwether had already gathered around the tonic case. Croft's eyes moved across the street and found Etta and stopped, and he smiled, not a cruel smile. A gentle, sorrowing, forgiving smile, aimed at her across 100 feet of mud, and he inclined his head like a man greeting a woman he pities, and he turned back to his tonics. Etta stood there and shook. Josiah put himself between them, not fast, not making anything of it, just moved his body a foot to the left, and the street was gone. He said, "Look at me." She did. He said, "A name's a coat somebody else can throw mud on. Doesn't mean you have to take it off and go around cold." Etta laughed. It came out wrong and wet, and it startled both of them. He said, "We came for a barrel of nails. Let's get the nails." They got the nails. The lantern supper was the 3rd Saturday of May, in the hall behind the church, and it was the only thing Bellwether did all year that could be called a celebration. Josiah asked her on a Wednesday evening while he was scraping a hoof. He said, "Into the horse's leg, there's a supper Saturday." Etta said, "I've heard." He set the hoof down, straightened, wiped his hands. He said, "I don't dance. I never learned, and I'm too big for it. And my wife used to say watching me try was the closest she ever came to blasphemy." It was the first time he'd said the word wife out loud in front of her. It went through the yard like a bell. Etta held very still. "Go on," she said. He said, "So I'm not asking you to dance. I'm asking if you'd stand next to me in that hall, while every soul in this valley works out why I look pleased." She said, "You know what they'll say. I've got a fair idea. They'll say she's too plain to be standing there. They'll say you took in the Missouri woman out of pity." Josiah scratched the mare's neck. He said, "They'll say a good many things, and every one of them will be a thing they thought, upstanding in a warm room." He looked at her. "I've buried a wife, Miss Barlowe. I know what a woman looks like when she's still standing after the road's emptied out. That's the only kind of pretty I've got any use for anymore." Etta Barlowe found she could not speak. She said finally, "I don't have a dress," he said. "Wear the black one. You look like the judgment of God in it." And she laughed. A real one this time, out loud, ugly and surprised, with her head back, and the mare startled, and Josiah caught the halter and grinned at the ground where she couldn't see it. She wore the black one. She pressed it on the table with an iron heated in the forge. She pinned her hair the way her mother used to, and she pinned a sprig of syringa in it, white, from the bush by the creek, and it smelled like orange peel and snow. The hall was gold with lantern light and loud with fiddle. When they came through the door, the room did that thing rooms do. Not silence, exactly. A hitch. Like a wagon going over a rut. Josiah offered his arm. Etta took it. Harlan Pike was standing by the cider. He looked at Etta on Josiah Rennick's arm, and something crossed his face that was not anger. It was grief. He'd made his choice in a doorway with his hat in his hands, and now he had to stand in a room and watch what it had cost him. Etta felt no triumph. She was surprised by that. Somebody near the pie table said, half behind her hand, "She's too plain to be standing up there with him." It carried the way those things are built to. Etta didn't slow and she didn't turn. She said to Josiah quietly, without heat, "Good. Then nobody in this valley can ever say you married a picture." And Josiah Rennick laughed, out loud, a sound nobody in Bellwether had heard come out of that man since '81. And the whole hall turned around and stared at him, and he didn't care. And Etta stood beside him with her chin up and her cracked red hands folded and let them look. Dr. Ansel Croft played the fiddle for an hour. He was good at it. Of course he was. Wendell Fry sat on a bench by the wall with a cup of cider he wasn't drinking. Etta sat down next to him after a while to rest her feet. He said, without preamble, 11 years next month. Etta said, "Your wife?" "Ida." He turned the cup around. "Still set out 2 cups every morning. Can't seem to break the habit. My boy says it's a sad thing to see, is it?" Wendell considered that seriously, the way old men do, with all the time in the world. He said, "I don't know. It's the only argument I've got left with the fact of it." Etta looked out at the room, at the fiddler, at Josiah, standing by the door with his hat in his hand, looking straight at her across the whole crowded hall. She said, "There's time yet, Wendell." The old man snorted. "I'm 81 years old, girl," Etta said, "and you got up and put on a good shirt and came to a supper. That's not a man who's finished." Wendell Fry didn't answer that, but he drank his cider. The knock came 4 nights later at 2 in the morning in the worst of the second rise. The Chinook had come through and taken the last of the high snow off in 1 warm week, and the Bitterroot came up out of its banks and took the ferry crossing and left the North Road under 3 feet of brown water. 3 hard lost man's knock. Not a lost man's knock. A knock with panic in the wrist. Josiah had the rifle down before Etta was out of the chair. He cracked the door. Toby Creel stood in the rain, 16 and gray-faced, streaming, with a horse blown out behind him. He said, "It's Nellie Hobbs. It's been since yesterday morning. She's, Mr. Rennick, she's been at it since yesterday morning and it ain't coming." Etta was already moving. Trunk. Latch. Oilcloth. Toby said, and his voice broke on it. "Ott won't let nobody in." Etta stopped with the scissors in her hand. "What? He's drunk," Toby said. "He's on the porch with the 10-gauge. There's a letter. Croft's been telling it all over, that the Missouri woman killed a doctor's wife with her hands. Ott says no witch is going to touch Nellie. He run off Mrs. Kell. He run off his own mother." Etta looked at Josiah. Josiah was already pulling on his coat. The Hobbs place was 2 miles up the North Fork and the North Road was gone. So they went along the bench through the timber with the mare fighting them the whole way and the rain coming sideways, and Etta rode behind Josiah with the trunk lashed and her arms around his chest, and she did not think about that at all, then or after. They came into the yard at 3. Ott Hobbs was on the porch in the lamplight with a shotgun across his knees and a bottle by his boot. 28 years old and about 90 pounds of pure terror stuffed into a man's body. Behind him, through the door, came a sound that Etta had heard 106 times and would never in her life get used to. The sound a woman makes when she has been at it too long and has stopped screaming and started praying and can't remember which words. Ott stood up. The shotgun came up with him. He said, "Don't." Josiah got down. He said, "Ott, you know what she is." Ott said, "The whole town knows." Doctor said it plain, she kills them. She killed a doctor's own wife. Etta stepped down off the mare into the mud. She walked toward the porch. Josiah said, "Sharp, Etta." She kept walking. Ott swung the barrels on her. His hands were shaking so hard the lamplight jumped on the metal. He said, "I'll do it. I swear to God I'll do it." Etta walked up to the bottom step and stopped, and the muzzle was 3 feet from her chest, and she looked past it into the boy's wet, ruined face. She said, "How long has she been pushing?" He blinked. Etta said, "Answer me. How long?" "Since," he swallowed, "since dark, since about dark." 6 hours, Etta said, "and she's quiet now." "You hear how she's quiet now?" Ott's mouth came open. Etta said, "Ott Hobbs, I am going to tell you the truth, and then you are going to decide something. Your wife has maybe an hour, maybe less. I don't know what's wrong in there, but I know it's wrong, and there is no doctor in this valley, and the road is under the river." She took 1 step up. She said, "You can pull that trigger. It's a short reach. Or you can move." She took another step. She said, "But she has an hour either way, and you have got about 10 seconds to be the man she thought she married." Nobody breathed. And then Ott Hobbs lowered the shotgun and sat down on his own porch and put his face in his hands, and Etta went past him through the door without another word. The room was hot and stank of tallow and sweat and fear. Nellie Hobbs was 19 years old and the color of paper. She had bitten through her lip. When she saw Etta, she started to cry silently from exhaustion, and she reached out one hand and Etta took it, and it was cold. Etta had the trunk open on the floor before her knees hit the boards. She said over her shoulder, in a voice that did not sound like the woman who'd shelled peas at his table for 3 weeks, "Josiah, every pot in this house on that stove, full, boiling now, every lamp lit. Bring the table over here. Toby, out. Get out and stay out." She had the soap out. She was scrubbing to the elbow in water so hot it left her arms scalded pink, and then carbolic, and she counted while she did it, the way she always counted, because her mother had counted. She turned back the sheet. She went still for 1 second. Josiah, coming through with the lamp, saw her face in the instant before she put it away, and it frightened him worse than the shotgun had. "Breech," she said, "and it's been sitting." Nellie whispered, "Is it dead? Is my baby dead?" Etta put her red hand flat on the girl's belly and held it there and closed her eyes. She said, "No, no, honey, it's alive and it's stuck, and it's cross about it, and you and I are going to have a hard hour. Look at me, Nellie. You are going to do exactly what I say when I say it, and not 1 second before." She looked up. "Josiah, set that lamp there. Then wash, to the elbow. Soap first, then the brown bottle. Count to 60. He stared at her. Etta said, "I need 2 hands that don't shake, and everybody else in this house is drunk or 16. Josiah Rennick stood in a hot lamplit room in the middle of the flood with the smell of blood in it and the sound of a young woman dying by inches. And 8 years fell on him all at once, and Etta saw it. She saw it go through him like a rail spike. He was in another room. There was another lamp. There was another woman, and he had held her hand and been useless. And he had listened to her stop. His breath came short, Etta said, and her voice changed, and it was not the midwife anymore. "Josiah." He looked at her. She said, I know where you are. Come back." The rain hammered on the roof. Josiah Rennick went to the basin and washed his hands. He counted to 60. He came and knelt down in the blood in the lamplight and said, "Tell me what to do." It took 2 hours. Etta talked the entire time. Low, steady, unbroken, the way you talk to a horse in a burning barn. Nonsense, half of it. And it didn't matter, because it wasn't the words. Once she said, "Josiah, hold her knee right there, don't you move it." Once she said, "Nellie, not yet, not yet. Look at the ceiling and count the boards." Once she cursed, and Nellie laughed, weeping, a horrible broken sound, and it broke something loose in the room. At the worst of it, her mother's scissors slipped in the wet and hit the floorboards, and the bone grip cracked clean in half. Etta didn't look down. She said, "Josiah." In the tray, the other pair. Antony found them and put them in her palm. And near 5 in the morning, with the window going gray, Etta Barlowe drew a girl out of Nellie Hobbs and turned her over on her forearm, like she was carrying a loaf of bread, and cleared her mouth with the bulb and struck her once, hard, between the shoulder blades. Nothing. 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 And then a small, enraged, furious wail went up in that filthy hot room, and Josiah Rennick, on his knees, dropped his head down onto his own bloody forearms and did not lift it for some time. Etta laid the baby on Nellie's chest, she said. Well, there she is. She stood up. She hadn't stood in 2 hours, and the room went sideways, and she caught the door frame and got herself out onto the porch and into the rain, and Ott Hobbs was still sitting there, and he had not moved in 3 hours, and he was crying the way men cry, which is with no sound at all. He said, without looking up, Is she? Etta said. You have a daughter, he said. I wanted a boy. He said it stupidly, out of shock, and then he heard himself say it, and then, from inside the house, the baby cried. Ott Hobbs got up and got 2 steps toward that door, and his legs went out from under him. And he went down on his knees on his own porch boards, and stayed there, shaking, and Etta Barlowe stood in the rain, with her arms red to the elbow, and watched a man be broken in the right direction, and she let him have it privately, and she looked away. Dr. Ansel Croft rode up at 8 in the morning with Reverend Teague. Toby had gone for them at dawn, before anyone thought to stop him, because Toby was 16 and had been raised to believe that when things went wrong you fetched the doctor. Croft came into that yard in his gray coat, and he took in the scene with one practiced sweep. The mud, the exhausted blacksmith on the step, the woman sitting on an overturned bucket with her hands hanging between her knees. He said warmly, sorrowfully, pitched to Carrie, Ah, Miss Barlowe. Again. Etta lifted her head. Croft was already turning to Teague, already shaking his head, already arranging his face. He said, Reverend, I did warn you. Where is the poor woman? I'll do what can be done, though from the look of it, mother and child are well. Croft stopped. He turned around slowly. Etta stood up off the bucket. She was filthy. Her hair had come down. Her forearms were stained to the elbow, and she had not slept in 26 hours, and she was not shaking anymore. She said, Breech presentation. Delivered at 5:05. The child is nursing. The mother is torn, and I've stitched her, and she'll mend. There's no fever, doctor, and there won't be, because everything that went in that room went in clean. Croft's face did an extraordinary thing. It stayed kind. He said gently, You must be very tired. Reverend, I think we should. I asked you to wash your hands, Etta said. The yard went quiet. I asked you, she said, in front of Lavinia. And you said soap was for laundresses, and you laughed, and she laughed too, because she loved you and she thought you were clever. Croft said coldly now, This is grief, Reverend. It's a sad thing, but it's grief, and it's slander besides. The door of the cabin opened. Ott Hobbs came out onto the porch. He hadn't slept either. He had his wife's blood on his shirt and his daughter's on his sleeve. And he was holding the shotgun by the barrel like something he'd found and didn't want. He said, You told me she killed a woman. Croft turned. He put out a hand, the doctor's hand, the one that had gentled 1,000 frightened patients. He said, My friend, Ott said, You sat in Teague's parlor and you told me, and you smiled while you said it. And I stood on that porch with this gun and I nearly kept her out. His voice went up and cracked, and he was crying again, in front of everybody, and past caring. He said, She walked into it. She walked right up into the barrels, and my wife is alive. He came down the steps. Josiah Rennick stood up off the step, easy, unhurried, and put one hand flat on Ott Hobbs's chest and took the shotgun out of his hand with the other, and said quietly, No, not today. Today you go inside and hold your daughter. Ott went inside. Josiah Rennick turned around and looked at Ansel Croft, and he did not say one word, and Croft got on his horse. Reverend Ambrose Teague stood alone in the middle of the yard with his hat in his hands. He said, Miss Barlowe. Etta said, Sunday. He blinked. She said, I'll come Sunday, Reverend, not for you, for her. The Bitterroot went down that week the way it always does, sullen, an inch a day, leaving fence line and drowned rabbits and a rack of gray branches in the willows. On Sunday morning, the sun came out over the sapphires for the first time in 3 weeks, and the whole valley steamed. Bellwether went to church. Reverend Teague had chosen his text badly. He was 10 minutes into it and sweating when the door at the back of the church opened. Etta Barlowe came in. She wore the black dress. Her hair was pinned. Her hands were folded in front of her, and they were red and cracked, and the right thumb was wrapped in a strip of clean linen. Nellie Hobbs came behind her, on her husband's arm, walking like a woman made of glass, 11 days out of childbed and white as chalk and absolutely determined. And in Etta Barlowe's arms, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth-lined flannel from the bottom of a battered trunk, was a baby girl, 11 days old. Nobody moved. Teague's voice trailed off in the middle of a sentence. Etta walked up the center aisle of that church. She didn't hurry. Her boots were loud. She stopped at the front and she turned around and she faced them. Harlan Pike and his sister and the women who had crossed the street, and Prudence Kell and Toby Creel and Wendell Fry in his good shirt at the back. She didn't say anything. She just stood there and let them look at her and at what she was holding. And then, in the back row, an 81-year-old man who had buried his wife 11 years ago and still set out 2 cups every morning, put his hands on the pew in front of him and pushed himself up onto his feet. Wendell Fry stood. Nobody had asked him to. He just stood, alone, at the back of a silent church, breathing hard from the effort, and he stayed standing. Prudence Kell stood. Toby Creel stood, and knocked his hymnal on the floor doing it. Ott Hobbs stood, and his mother stood beside, and then the whole Hobbs pew, and then the Creels, and then the row behind, and then a slow, awkward, scraping rustle went through that little white building as 100 people in Bellwether, Montana Territory, got up out of their seats to stand for a plain woman with ruined hands. Reverend Ambrose Teague stood at his own pulpit with a Bible open under his palm and nothing to say. And to his credit, a small credit but his, he shut the book and stood too. At the back by the door, Josiah Rennick had not sat down in the first place. Nellie Hobbs stepped up beside Etta and took her daughter back, and she said, loud enough for the room because she had thought about it for 11 days, "Mr. Rennick, what was your wife's name?" Josiah went white. The church waited, he said. "Horse." "Cora." Nellie looked down at the baby. She said, "Then that's who this is." Dr. Ansel Croft left Bellwether on the Tuesday eastbound and never came back through the valley again. He had a good coat and a fiddle and a case of tonics, and there were 100 other towns. Etta thought about that sometimes, later, and found she didn't need him punished. It was enough that he'd stood in a muddy yard while a drunk boy told the truth about him out loud, and had gotten on a horse and gone. You don't always get to see the reckoning. Sometimes all you get is the sound of somebody leaving. She came in from the pump on a Thursday evening in June and found something on the table. A pair of scissors. Hand-forged, bone grip, shaped and pinned and sanded smooth. The steel folded and folded again, blued dark, the pivot true, the edges so fine they'd part a hair. On the inside of one handle, where only her thumb would ever find it, 3 letters, struck small. E.B. Beside them, a second chair had been pulled up to the fire. The chair with the shawl on it was gone, not thrown out. She found it later, folded in a cedar box on the shelf above the bed, with a woman's hairbrush and a small iron horse a man had made once for a child who never got to hold it. Josiah came in from the shop and washed at the basin and hung his hat and sat down and started eating, like nothing on God's earth had happened. Etta stood there holding the scissors. She said, "You didn't say anything." He said, "Nothing much to say." "Old pear broke," she said. "Josiah." He set his fork down between bites the way he did. He said, "I've been sitting in one chair for 8 years telling myself that was all the room I had. And that's a lie a man tells himself so he don't have to be brave about anything ever again." He looked at her. He said, "You never asked me for one single thing since the day you got in that wagon." Etta said, "I know." He said, "I want you to ask me for something." The creek ran on outside. The coals ticked. Etta Barlowe set the scissors down on the table very carefully, the way she'd have set down a newborn, and she said, "Stay." Josiah Rennick said, "I never went anywhere." They were married in the white church, at the north end of Bellwether on the last Saturday in August, when the valley was gold and the smoke from the Idaho fires made the sun go red at evening. It was a small wedding. Reverend Teague read the words, and he read them well, and he did not once look at anyone but the two of them, and when it was finished he shook Josiah's hand a moment longer than he needed to. Whatever passed between those men was between them. Nellie Hobbs sat in the second pew with a fat, furious 4-month-old Cora on her knee. Ott sat beside her, sober 6 weeks and counting the days like a man counting money. Prudence Kell cried, which surprised everybody, including her. Toby Creel had a new collar and it was killing him. Harlan Pike came and stood at the back and stayed to the end, and Etta was glad of it. Etta wore blue, not white. She was 34 years old and had buried a mother, a father, a reputation, and a life, and she'd have felt like a fraud in white. Blue and her mother's brooch and her hair down at the sides the way Josiah once said, exactly once, that he liked it. She walked up the aisle alone. Nobody gave her away. Nobody had ever owned her to give. But when she got to the front, Josiah Rennick put out his hand, open, palm up, waiting, the hand of a man who has held iron and horses and one dying woman and one living child, and Etta put her red, cracked, 107 times scrubbed hand into it, not to lean on, to walk beside. Teague said, "Do you take this woman?" And Josiah Rennick, who was not a talker and who had not planned it, said, "She walked up into a shotgun for a girl she'd never met." I don't know what a man's supposed to say. I say yes. Nobody clapped. Bellwether was not a clapping town. They stood, though, every one of them, and that was better. Afterward, out in the churchyard, with the light going long and red, Wendell Fry came up and took Etta's hand in both of his and held it. He said, "You remember what you told me at the supper?" Etta said, "I do." The old man's eyes were wet, and he was not embarrassed about it, which is one of the few good things about being 81. He said, "I put one cup away this spring, just the one. Took me 11 years and a stranger telling me I wasn't finished." He let go of her hand. He looked up at the little bell hung in the frame above the church door. Bellwether had been named for it, back when a man with more hope than sense had figured a town ought to be named for the thing that leads. Wendell said, "Nobody rings it but for funerals anymore." He reached up and took the rope, and an old widower rang the bell over Bellwether, Montana, once hard, for no reason on earth but joy. And the sound went out over the churchyard, and the drying river, and the hay ground, and the ridge where 2 graves lay under an iron marker made by hand. And it did not come back. Because a woman is never plain to the man who has watched her hands. And because there is no season in a life, however late, however cold, that God cannot put a bell in.